Now, there are more than 2 billion Christians worldwide, and sadly, many of them are being persecuted. Whether it's the Armenian Christians bullied out of their homeland by neighbouring Azerbaijan, churches bombed and burned down in Pakistan, or the regular drumbeat of anti-Christian violence in sub-Saharan Africa. So why do we never seem to hear about it? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to welcome to the Sceptic Julian Mann, former Church of England vicar and an evangelical journalist based in Lancashire. Welcome to the Sceptic, Julian.
Thank you, Laurie. Nice to see you.
Right, so before we get into this, can you just give us an idea of where Christians are worldwide and how many of them there are?
Well, I never know quite how they compute these figures of 2 or 2.5 billion Christians around the world. I mean, I hope they wouldn't include sort of cultural Christians like Richard Dawkins, because that would be rather ironic if he got included in the overall figure of 2 or 2.5 billion Christians around the world. But there are an awful lot of Christians in Africa. In sub-Saharan Africa, there are about 650 million Christians, compared, according to Pew Research Center, 241 million Muslims. So Africa is a continent in which there are a lot of Christians, and these would, a large proportion of those would be pretty active. I mean, not purely cultural Christians, but regular churchgoers and actively practicing their faith.
Yeah, and in terms of denominations in Africa, I mean, certainly there's some Church of England presence there. What does it look like overall?
I don't precisely know the numbers, but I think there are, many millions of Anglicans in Africa, because those nations, or nations as they now are, were part of the British Empire, and missionaries from Britain were able to use the Pax Britannica, as it were, to spread the word, and they were instrumental in bringing about the presence of the Christian church in that continent. Not exclusively, but to a significant extent. There were Roman Catholic presence as well, obviously. I mean, the missionaries who went out in the 19th century to these countries went out at great personal cost. It wasn't sort of 5-star accommodation or anything like that. I mean, or even camper vans. I mean, it was, a great risk. Many of them died, in their endeavours.
Right, so into the story here. So there's a lot of Christians in Africa and there's a lot of Muslims too. And one of the countries where there's a lot of both is Nigeria, where there's a lot of conflict between the two and it's quite unstable. And this charity Open Doors that you've been talking about has been reporting on this. And essentially there's a lot of anti-Christian violence going on here. So tell us what's going on.
Well, I visited the city of Jos, which is in Plateau State in northern central Nigeria, in New Year 2012. And this was after a spate of attacks by Boko Haram Islamist militants on Christian churches, including an attack on the Bishop of Jos's wife in 2006 during the Danish cartoons controversy, in which she was very severely injured. So that was the background when I went out there. And just to give you an illustration of the vulnerability of the Christians in Jos, I went to the Anglican Cathedral on New Year's Day for a New Year's Day service in 2012 to be interviewed by the Bishop of Jos, Ben Kwashi. And before the service, all the clergy, cathedral clergy, were assembled, and he gave them a very stern talking to, because somebody had left a large metal bin abutting the outside wall of the cathedral. And I inquired as to what he was talking to them about, and I was told that it would be very easy for a terrorist on a motorbike to lob an incendiary device into the large metal bin and create an enormous explosion, which could, kill a lot of people inside the cathedral. So that's sort of vulnerability of them. I recall 2 sentries with rifles stationed outside the cathedral itself. I believe they were provided by the state government. So no, they weren't federal troops, but they were security provided by the state government. So that added some presence, but still, I mean, they couldn't stop somebody on a motorbike driving past and lobbing a bomb into a bin like that. So that's just the vulnerability they face, and gives you an illustration of it.
Yeah, so clearly a very febrile state of affairs there. So just tell us about the ongoing tensions between Muslims and Christians.
Well, Nigeria is a state that was created when the British granted independence, and this is very simplistic, but it was a state created out of a Muslim north and a Christian south. And what is happening is that terrorist groups based in the north are attacking Christians, and they have been attacking the Christian minority in the northern states. In a place like Plateau, which is sort of mainly Plateau state, in which Jos is the capital, is a substantial Muslim presence, but it's sort of majority Christian. But Muslim, Islamist terrorists have been coming into the area and attacking churches, as we've seen. What is interesting about the Open Doors film I saw at Hisham Free Methodist Church, which resulted in the article that I sent to Toby and Will, I'd said in the piece that Benue state, in which Pastor Barnabas lives in a displacement camp, or a camp for displaced persons, I said it was northern Nigeria. Actually, I should have looked at the map, because it's central Nigeria. It's in the mid-belt, just south of the capital, Abuja. So what is happening is that this Islamist violence is spreading south. It's spreading into the central states now. And I think that is extremely serious. I mean, I'm not saying that the violence in the north is not serious. It is very serious, but the Islamist violence now spreading into these central states, which raises the question, what is the federal government doing about it? Why is the federal government not deploying federal troops? Clearly, you can't rely on state troops in the northern states, because the commanders wouldn't be reliable. They're bound to be, many of them sympathetic to Boko Haram and the Muslim Fulani herdsmen. So why isn't the federal government deploying troops? Why aren't they deploying special forces to take out the ringleaders? Why aren't they getting advice from the Israelis as to how to deal with this kind of thing? So, this spreading of the violence raises all sorts of questions about what the federal government isn't doing and why it isn't doing it, taking appropriate action to protect not merely the Christian minority in the north, but the Christian majority in the middle and southern states of Nigeria.
Right, okay, so it's Boko Haram that people might have heard of, and then it's also the Muslim Fulani tribesmen. And it will be interesting to get a sense of sort of how systematic this is. I mean, are these sort of terrorist cells, or do they have territory of their own? I mean, what's kind of the structure of these organizations?
Well, it would seem that they have a lot of rope in the north, in those majority Muslim areas, and that they have a pretty free hand. And they've been killing many thousands of Christians in Nigeria in the past 5 years. And indeed before that.
Yeah, and those being 17,000 Nigerian Christians losing their lives because of violence between 2019 and 2023, which is, of course, an enormous number. And in terms of sort of the causes of this, obviously partly it's perhaps, Nigeria is a sub-Saharan African country, and you mentioned that the government hasn't really got a good grip on this. But I'm interested to know sort of how systematic the attacks are. I mean, is this just a series of sort of semi-random terrorist incidents, or is it more there's a systematic attempt to target the Christians here?
Yes, that's what it looks very much like. Attacks on Christian communities and Christian churches being very specifically targeted. I mean, yes, Muslims have been killed. And undoubtedly, there has been retaliatory action by those who've been attacked. But just to give you an illustration of the sort of difference, I suppose, Laurie, between Christianity and Islam, I mean, or militant Islam, I'm not talking about more peaceable Islam, but Christianity and militant Islam. In that service on January the 1st, 2012, nobody in that congregation would have been armed. They turn up to worship God in Christ. That's what they're there for, peaceably. Nobody there would have been armed. But you can be pretty sure that, a mosque in northern Nigeria, if Christians were to attack that mosque, they would meet with an armed response from members of the worshipping community there. So it just sort of highlights really the difference between the Christianity in a country like Nigeria and the fairly militant form of Islam that's practiced there. And, this leaves the Christians very vulnerable.
Absolutely. And one of the other figures you pointed is about Christians not just being killed, but being displaced across Africa. And in fact, you said it's 16.2 million Christians displaced because of violence. I mean, that's an enormous number. Just tell us a bit about how that's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see with the failure to provide an adequate response from the governments of some of these countries, which aren't Islamic states by any means. Nigeria is a democracy, supposedly. You can see, it's an enormous number of people living in the sort of conditions in which Pastor Barnabas is living, having lived on a farm. It's an enormous number of people living in camps for internally displaced peoples.
Okay, and so you have millions of displaced people, thousands of people dying in terrorist attacks. And you'd think, therefore, that in the Christian West, or at least the post-Christian West, perhaps some would say, that this would be more of something that's talked about in the media, that we'd hear more about this all the time. So, why isn't it?
Well, I think the big educators are the sort of Daily Sceptic and the Free Speech Union about why this sort of thing. Because clearly, in the pecking order of neo-Marxist victimhood, Christians are very, very low down that list, aren't they? In fact, they would be identified with colonialism and the oppressive forces. So I think it's that neo-Marxist woke mind virus that results in almost a blindness or unwillingness, really, to the plight of Christians in places like Africa. There is some media coverage, but I recall when the Archbishop of Jos visited our parish in South Yorkshire when I was a vicar in around 2010. He went on BBC Radio Sheffield, and he really tried to challenge this narrative that it's sort of 6 of one and half a dozen of the other in Nigeria. It really isn't. And the media at that time just didn't seem to get it. They put it down to sort of tribal squabbling almost. And there is something in that. But the overwhelming majority, for the reasons I tried to give, are Christians being attacked and killed.
Okay, so you mentioned that part of the reason that Western media is kind of unwilling to cover this is that Christians are sort of further down the woke pyramid. But as you mentioned, that interview was in South Yorkshire. And I wonder if another reason that people are unwilling to talk about this is that it actually feeds into, or people are nervous about fueling ongoing tensions with multiculturalism. Because, of course, South Yorkshire is a place where there have been a lot of tensions with that. And in fact, even this week, there was a sentencing for appalling crimes of Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs against young white women. And so I wonder if the tensions between Muslims and Christians are worse in Africa than they are in Britain or in the West. But I wonder if part of the reason that people are unwilling to discuss this is because they don't want to give the sense that the same issues might be reflected in their own countries. Would you say that that's partly what's going on here?
Yes, that could well be it. Yes, you could well. That sounds very, 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 very plausible.
Okay, so we've heard how the Church of England has turned towards woke ideology in recent years. Do you think that's partly an explanation as to why they have been, not standing up well enough and forcefully enough for these Christians who are being persecuted?
You see, the Archbishop of Canterbury is quite admirable in the way he visits these countries. Justin Welby, I don't think you could accuse him of not highlighting the problem and quite courageously visiting some of these countries, Sudan and Nigeria and so on. The problem for the Church of England is it's recently voted for services of same-sex blessing. And this has caused deep disquiet amongst the Orthodox, biblically Orthodox African churches. And of course, is quite offensive to Islam as well, both in its more peaceable form and in its more militant form. I mean, Muslims don't go down, particularly buy into all that same-sex services of same-sex blessing. So this is causing deep disquiet amongst Orthodox Anglicans in Africa. And, the Church of England is really in the doghouse as far as they're concerned. So, I mean, it's what I'm trying to say is it's a two-way street, really. The Africans are not particularly enamored with the Church of England. And obviously, the narrow revisionist majority in the Church of England are not particularly enamored with Orthodox African Anglicans, whom they consider to be homophobic. So I think that's how the politics of the situation is playing out. But the other factor is, of course, is that the Church of England is a declining and denomination. Its trends continue up to 2050. There's going to be hardly anybody in it. Whereas the African churches are thriving and pretty full. They also have children as well. That's another factor. English people aren't having children, fewer numbers, and that's having an impact on the growth of churches. I'm not saying it's a guarantee, but children will immediately go. But at least it provides some chance that the next generation will adopt the Christian faith and run with it.
Okay, well, Julian Mann, thanks very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Well, Laurie, thank you for having me.